This is the resting place of Matthew Kowal. He was born in 1923 in Ivano-Frankivsk in Ukraine and died here in Edinburgh 81 years later in 2004. This is the story of what he did in the Second World War and how that led to him ending up in Scotland. The story starts some years before the Second World War, in 1932. At that time, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union and ruled by the brutal dictator Joseph Stalin. Many Ukrainians wanted independence, which the country did not get until 1991, and Stalin saw this as a threat to the Soviet Union. As part of the Soviet policy of Russification, Stalin imposed rules forcing farmers to hand over their crops and have them transported out of Ukraine. This created massive food shortages and eventually famine. It is thought that around 7 million Ukrainians died of starvation in 1932 and 1933. The famine is called Holodomor, literally death by starvation. Stalin thought this would help eliminate the Ukrainian nationalists, but it actually only emboldened a young generation to fight back against the Soviet regime. The victims are remembered each year in a ceremony at this memorial in Carfin near Motherwell. It was built and installed by the Scottish Ukrainian community in 1977 as a tribute to the Ukrainians who came here after the war. But we will come back to that later. The next part of the story is all about the establishment of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or UPA. By 1942, the war in Eastern Europe between Germany and the forces of the Soviet Union had reached Ukraine. You can see how far the German forces had reached by the orange areas on the map. In the years leading up to that point, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army had formed as a resistance to the Soviet Army and the oppression of Stalin. The army was known as UPA, UPA, or Ukraińska Powstańcza Armia. But now they were fighting for their country against two enemies, and also they did not have proper weapons or machinery. They were able to steal a lot of it from captured enemies. They also had a proper military structure with divisions and regiments. In 1944, German intelligence estimated that there were over 200,000 UPA soldiers. Matthew Kowal joined the Galician Division, which covered the region of West Ukraine, including Ivano-Frankivsk. My dad and I spoke to Peter Kowal, whose father was also an UPA soldier and has done a lot of writing and research on UPA and the lives of the Ukrainians who settled in Scotland. He told me what Matthew Kowal's role was in the UPA.
Now, what he did was very interesting because if you read this history, you'll see that the UPA basically got hunted out into extinction. Uh-huh. When the war finished in 1945, many young Ukrainians joined the UPA and went into the forests, and then they spent the next 5 years being hunted by the NKVD, which is the hunted by the secret police, the Russian secret police. Yeah. And there are some really sad stories about young. You see, when they were in these forests, they had to dig holes in the soil and make underground bunkers. Right. And your grandfather would have helped to construct these things and would have helped to carry messages from one bunker to another over distances of miles.
Right.
And also he would have to go through a town sometimes, or avoid a town and just go a roundabout way between these bunkers carrying messages. It was a very dangerous thing to do, because if he had been caught, he would have been shot.
This is Matthew Kowal in his UPA uniform. You can see the Gaussian regiment badge on his right lapel. And here is the actual badge from that uniform he kept all these years. And this is the Iron Cross Medal of Honor that Ukraine gave to former UPA soldiers after it became independent in 1991. You can see the letters of the Ukrainian alphabet spelling UPA. As the war came to an end, it started to become obvious that the Soviet army was going to defeat the Germans in the east. In one single battle, the Gaussian division lost 10,000 of the 13,000 total soldiers. After that battle, many UPA soldiers escaped to what is now Slovakia and fought along with some remaining German regiments. But even as the war was declared over, many were captured by the Soviets and were shot. Matthew Kowal and a small group of friends were lucky and managed to escape the fighting in Slovakia. They walked across Austria in stolen uniforms and with stolen guns. You can see from the map of how territory was divided up at the end of the war that Austria was not in Soviet control. Eventually they were spotted by a platoon from the American army and they surrendered. They were taken to a British prisoner of war camp in Rimini in northern Italy. Life in the Rimini camp was tough, but Matthew Kowal had some time to relax now that the fighting was over. Today Rimini is a big beach resort, and Matthew Kowal even went back there for holidays later in his life. In 1994 he gave an interview to the BBC radio about his time in the camp.
Radio Scotland has a series in which people from outside Scotland who've lived there for 30 years or more talk about the objects that mean most to them. What would they grab if their house was on fire? The result is a fascinating insight into a person's experience. This week's programme included a Uruguayan vet, a South African music therapist, and a Ukrainian builder, Matthew Kowal. He treasures his military cross, which was awarded to him recently for his services to Ukrainian resistance in the Second World War, and another small object which brings back a powerful memory of the time he was in an Italian prisoner of war camp.
Here in my hand I'm holding a little black object, about 1.5 inches square. It's a black starfish I picked up in Rimini, Italy in 1946 on the beach. It's a beautiful looking thing. It's like a dried flower head with 4 points. Very hard to touch and became glossy now. I am from the Ukraine and I was taken a prisoner of war in Italy. Being there in the camp during the winter 1946, it was very cold. There were 10,000 people with me, and we slept under the tents that was so thin you could see the stars at night. The food was terrible, was hardly anything of it, and the life altogether was horrible. No, one morning I got up and I could hardly put my clothes on, and I was paralyzed on my left side. So I didn't know what happened, but doctor told me it's rheumatics. And he promised me a job at the seaside when the weather gets better. Eventually I got that job working on a sewage project near the sea. And the time I could spend working very quickly. So I had time to go into the sea and into the sand maybe 10 times in one day. So after 6 weeks, I was completely cured. One day, when I laid in the sand, something jagged my side, and that was that starfish. I thought this was something strange. I laid on it, and it jagged the same side as it was sore. I put it in my pocket, took it into the camp, and you know, like everybody else, you have got a little box that you keep your little treasures you possess. And I put that in that box and brought it over here with me and still holding on to it.
Snatched from the Flames on Radio Scotland.
1947, the Ukrainians in Rimini POW camp had been there for nearly 2 years. Allied forces were trying to work out how to close down the camps. At the same time, Italy was having elections, and they voted in a socialist government that was sympathetic towards the Soviet Union. Italy reached an agreement with Stalin that would return all Soviet citizens held on Italian soil. For anyone who had been a member of UPA, this meant they were going home to be executed, or, if you're lucky, a life in prison in freezing cold Siberia. But before they could be sent back to the Soviet Union, the former UPA soldiers were rescued by the intervention of Canadian officers with Ukrainian ancestors, and by the Pope, who sent one of his bishops to negotiate with the Italian government. Eventually they agreed to allow the British Army to ship the Ukrainian soldiers back to Britain. And in late 1947, 1,500 Ukrainians arrived here at Leith Docks in Edinburgh. 500 of them went to to a camp in Lochbury in the Borders, and 1,000, including Matthew Kowal, went to Haddington, a few miles along the road in East Lothian. The Ukrainian POWs were held in a camp on the Amesfield estate in Haddington. During that time they worked on the local farms alongside many young locals, but after 2 years the British government decided that they should be moved to jobs in the community. Here's Peter Cormello again.
Matthew then had a choice. In 1948, they were still prisoners of war. And in December 1948, the British government decided to take them out of prison camps and put them into hostels and make them European voluntary workers. And they couldn't just get a job anywhere. They had to choose between the mines, the farms, or the factories.
Right.
They had to take a physically demanding job, regardless of how well qualified they were academically.
Sure.
So you've got Ukrainian doctors and scientists and teachers working in factories because that was the deal.
Matthew Kowal took a job with a building company, and he also started to see a young woman who he met when he had been working on the farms. Her name was Mary Foley. She was Scottish from Trinent in East Lothian. In 1951 they got married and they became important members of the Ukrainian community in Scotland. Eventually Matthew took over a building company and they moved to Edinburgh, where they helped to renovate a church in Leith that became the Ukrainian church in Scotland, and they established a club for the Ukrainian community in Edinburgh. But all of this time Matthew did not know what happened to his family in Ukraine. UPA had continued to fight for nearly 10 years after the end of the Second World War. But until the Soviet Union started to break up in the late 80s, communication with Ukraine was very difficult. But then the country opened up again, Matthew and Mary were able to visit Ukraine and meet his family and old friends, some of whom had been in UPA with him. You might be wondering why I'm telling this story. Well, it is a family story. Matthew and Mary Kowal had a son, Terry. In 1972, he married Mary Love, and they had 3 sons, Terry Jr., Peter, and Paul. In 1995, Terry Jr. married Rachel Shanley, and they have 2 sons, Matthew and Samuel. And Samuel Kowal is me. The Matthew Kowal in this story is my great-granddad. I hope you enjoyed hearing about his life story.